and I'm delighted to see so many distinguished guests here at the Constitution Project's 6th Annual Constitutional Champions Gala. Since 1997, the Constitution Project has been promoting safeguards to our Constitution by creating bipartisan committees of leading experts on a wide variety of what some say are intractable constitutional controversies. These committees, sometimes seemingly against all odds, have reached consensus simply by bringing to the task their open minds and a willingness to listen to each other, qualities that seem sorely lacking in today's Washington. And we don't just let this consensus, as some say, sit on the shelf. Through reports, statements, recommendations to policymakers, Hill briefings and meetings, testimony, and other activities, we promote this consensus to national, state, and local policymakers, the press, other advocates, and the public. In a time of disruptive intransigence and partisanship, we repeatedly demonstrate that constructive consensus is possible and will lead the way to constructive solutions. Just some of the issues we tackle in our rule of law program. We're fighting for civil liberties and privacy as the government employs various ways of spying on us and obtaining our personal information. Some new ways, such as drones and cybersecurity. Some old ways, such as ever-expanding video surveillance and the updated Electronic Communications Privacy Act. We've challenged the material support laws and the secrecy surrounding what the government is doing and how it is doing it in a variety of areas, such as the so-called targeted killing program. One of our recent efforts is the report of our task force on detainee treatment. And I should have something here. Oh, yes. This is the abridged version. The entire report is 557 pages, plus appendices and more information on our website. This report was released just 2 days ago. The task force's eminent experts had the courage to tackle an issue that both the executive and the legislative branches have avoided. With the terrible tragedy in Boston just last Monday very much on all of our minds, and bringing back the fear, grief, and horror of the events of September 11th, the task force's admonition that having as thorough as possible an understanding of what occurred during this period of serious threat and a willingness to acknowledge any shortcomings strengthens the nation and equips us to better cope with the next crisis and the ones after that. We are proud that when the executive and legislative branches were unwilling or unable to tackle this vital issue, the Constitution Project stepped forward, putting politics aside to help the country set right so much of what went wrong. In our criminal justice program, we're about to release an updated version of our Death Penalty Committee's report, and our clearinghouse of unlikely allies has produced a statement from approximately 150 former judges and prosecutors urging dramatic reforms to the Brady Law, which requires prosecutors to turn over exculpatory evidence to the defense. The clearinghouse has turned out dozens of amicus briefs, statements, and calls for clemency in cases of unjust convictions and sentences, and support for badly needed criminal justice reforms in Congress and around the country. And then there's the right to counsel and today's crisis in indigent defense, which of course is the subject of tonight's evening. Several years ago, we issued Justice Denied, which is the most comprehensive report on this issue in 30 years. One of our honorees tonight, Anthony Lewis, was the foremost chronicler of the Supreme Court's landmark right to counsel case, Gideon v. Wainwright. As you all know, Tony passed away on March 25th. As described by David Cole, whose article in the New York Review of Books is up front for your taking, Tony was more than a path-breaking newspaperman. He was the nation's most consistent voice for justice for over half a century. In his best-selling books, more than 30 years of columns for the New York Times, and his many contributions in these pages, Lewis insistently told stories of injustice with evident hope that by telling them, he might help create pressure to correct wrongs. He told one of those stories in his masterly Gideon's Trumpet, in which, as David describes it, Tony continued his long tradition of pursuing justice for those most in need. He saw the law as a means to check abuses by the powerful, protect the vulnerable, and hold the nation together. In that vein, I want to introduce to you one of the most recent efforts from our criminal justice program. Working with Arnold Porter, we produced a video to observe the 50th anniversary of Gideon, starring each of our honorees tonight, and narrated by the noted actor Martin Sheen. We are providing the video for free along with a curriculum for high school students, and we hope that Defending Gideon will be used by advocates of fair criminal trials everywhere to carry on the groundbreaking work of all of our honorees tonight: Tony Lewis, Abe Crash, Walter Mondale, and Bruce Jacob. Before we watch a short excerpt of Defending Gideon, I want to answer a question I'm often asked. How does the Constitution Project do so much? We must have a huge staff to do it. So this is my chance to thank our staff of a mere 10 people. And we did have an extra 5 who came on board to work solely on our task force report. But these people work with extraordinary diligence, commitment, and integrity. And it's my chance also to thank the many law firms and committee members who volunteer with the Constitution Project every year, as well as our board of directors, which supports us at every step of the way. And now, excerpts from Defending Gideon.
He was a beaten down 50-year-old man who looked like he was 75 and had the worst of life. That's what he looked like. That's what he was.
On June 3rd, 1961, Clarence Earl Gideon was arrested in Panama City, Florida. He was charged with breaking and entering into the Bay Harbor pool room. Reported stolen some wine and change from the vending machines. Gideon maintained his innocence. He had no money for bail, so he was kept in the county jail for 2 months awaiting trial. He had no money for a lawyer either.
In every case in a state court where there was a death sentence, the state court was obliged to furnish a lawyer to a defendant who was too poor to hire one. In addition, you're entitled to have a lawyer appointed if there were special circumstances such that you could say it was unfair, unjust for this defendant to have been tried without a lawyer. And there were no special circumstances in Gideon's case.
I'm sorry, but I will have to deny your request to appoint counsel to defend you in this case.
The United States Supreme Court says I am entitled to be represented by counsel.
Let the record show that the defendant has asked the court to appoint counsel to represent him in this trial.
Even though the Supreme Court had previously said that states did not have to provide lawyers to all defendants too poor to hire their own, Gideon, who had never had more than an 8th grade education and no formal legal training, was convinced it was his right.
I always believed that, and I thought that was actually a law. I thought that was a constitutional right, and I didn't know no different. Another man with money can hire a lawyer to represent him and get a better chance in the trial than I would get without an attorney. So to me, that was just common sense. There was no argument to it.
On January 8, 1962, an envelope from Clarence Earl Gideon arrived at the Supreme Court of the United States. He asked the Supreme Court to review his case
On the ground that I was made to stand trial without the aid of counsel.
In response, the Supreme Court decided to hear Gideon's case.
And since he was indigent and didn't have a lawyer, it was the practice of the Supreme Court to appoint a lawyer to represent him on his appeal.
They appointed me an attorney, Mr. A. Porter.
So from having no lawyer, he had the best lawyer in the country.
You know, being appointed to the Gideon case is probably the best plum that any lawyer has ever been given. I think every lawyer in the country would have grabbed at the chance to be appointed to represent Gideon. And if someone had said, Bruce, you can either represent the state or make the argument for Clarence Gideon, obviously I would have taken Gideon's side of the case.
Bruce Jacob was an assistant attorney general of Florida. The boss, the attorney general, gave him the job of arguing his case in the Supreme Court. He didn't expect to win. Nevertheless, he went about it in an extremely serious, dedicated way.
Bruce Jacob requested the other 49 state attorneys general to write amicus briefs supporting Florida's position. The Attorney General of Minnesota led the charge, but not as the state of Florida might have hoped.
We decided to solicit those same attorneys general on the side of an amicus brief that would say it should be a national legal principle that a right to counsel should be provided. We got a lot of support for it. This was new. This usually didn't happen. States would just duck on issues like that. In this case, 22 states said, no, this should be changed.
On January 15, 1963, the Supreme Court of the United States heard the case of Gideon versus Wainwright. On March 18, 1963, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled in Gideon's favor and held, against previous precedent, that the Constitution entitled Gideon to the assistance of a lawyer in his defense.
Well, I felt great. I received a telegram from Mr. Bolters congratulating me on the decision.
Even though the Supreme Court reversed Gideon's conviction, he did not go free immediately. Instead, he was given the opportunity for a new trial, this time with a lawyer.
It showed that the difference between not having an attorney and dealing with an attorney.
If you need for us to represent you, please fill out the application form this morning.
Ms. Field. Okay. All right. The first page. Please, if you got a question, please have a seat and we'll get your questions in just a moment. We got to keep this organized or we're going to be here all day.
When you are in court every day, facing pressures to process a lot of cases through the system, a public defender who is standing up saying, slow things down. I need more time to investigate. I need more time to look into what's going on here. Rather than seeing that as a lawyer who is living up to their constitutional obligation, it is easy to see that person as an obstructionist. And so I think the pressures in the system often drive players in the system to value efficiency and speed over justice, which actually can be time-consuming. It's a very dehumanizing system.
All right, what's the facts and basis for these fees, please?
I really do believe that you judge the character of a society, the commitment to the rule of law in a society, the civility of a society, not by how you treat the rich and the powerful and the privileged, but by how you treat the poor, the incarcerated, the condemned, the accused. It's in that context the only context, in my view, that you can really measure our commitment to the rule of law, our commitment to justice. And when you look at these cases where we're tolerating such bad lawyering, inexcusable lawyering, embarrassing lawyering, we're saying a lot about our commitment to justice. We're saying a lot about our commitment to the rule of law. And we're saying a lot about our values and our norms.
So help out, speak up, be a force for justice.
Constitutionproject.org, as I say, free of charge, so please spread it around. And now, let me introduce my good friend Steve Bright, who's the president and founder of the Southern Center for Human Rights. Steve is one of the country's most eloquent and effective advocates for a fair criminal justice system. His constant fight for systemic change led the Fulton Daily Law Report, Georgia's legal newspaper, to name him Newsmaker and Agitator of the Year for his contribution to bringing about the creation of a public defender system in Georgia, which I know is now basically kaput. I believe he's most proud about the agitator part, and we should all hope he never stops. Steve.
Thank you, Jenny, and good evening, everyone. It's my great honor, privilege, and pleasure tonight to just introduce the people who will be receiving this recognition for the heroic roles that they played not only in Gideon versus Wainwright, but ever since. And in one case, introducing the person who will give the award to that person. As we all know, Gideon held that any person who's hailed into court and can't afford a lawyer is entitled to one. And it's because lawyers are essential to fairness in our criminal justice system, but also, as the court said that day, so that everyone stands equal before the law. The same day, the Supreme Court decided Gideon and decided Douglas versus California and held that people had a right to a lawyer on appeal, and repeated there what it said earlier in Griffin versus Illinois: there can be no equal justice when the kind of justice a person gets depends upon the amount of money they have. Well, of course, we know that's not true. Today, nothing could matter more than how much money a person has in terms of the kind of justice they receive. The current Attorney General has said that the state of poor people's representation is a crisis. Almost everyone has acknowledged that we are not following the constitutional requirements set down in Gideon. I always remind people, Gideon didn't say having lawyers would be a good idea. They said it was constitutionally required. And yet, in the work that I do, we have no counsel courts, that is, courts with no lawyers at all. We have counsel in name only, that is, lawyers who just pretend to be. We have what you saw on the screen there, meet 'em and plead 'em, where those people that you saw pleading there met a lawyer for all 3 to 5 minutes, and the lawyer pled about 40 people guilty after that 3 to 5 minute meeting. And then we have what we often refer to as walking violations of the Sixth Amendment. But all of that, and all of the shortcomings in places like Georgia and Alabama and Texas, and I won't go through all the other states, does not diminish the decision in Gideon versus Wainwright. It established the lodestar of our aspirations as a society. We may not be there yet, but it tells us what kind of people we want to be, what kind of justice system we want to have, and what we hope to someday accomplish. It's been realized here, more in Washington than almost anywhere else, with the Public Defender Service here, which is the premier public defender service in the country. But it's been recognized in other places, and where it has been, people have received the same zealous representation that those with money have. In Colorado today, some people say you get a better representation from the public defender than you'll get from any private criminal lawyer that you will hire. Unfortunately, that's not true in a lot of other places. But where Gideon's been realized, the accused have been counseled, their questions have been answered, they've received professional advice and advocacy about their case in this very foreign world of the criminal courts. The innocent have been protected from wrongful convictions. those facing the death penalty and other extreme punishments had not suffered those punishments in many cases because lawyers marshaled the evidence about them and their backgrounds and their lives in mitigation of those punishments. And the people we recognize here tonight were not only there in 1962 and 1963 when Gideon was pending and ultimately decided by the Supreme Court, but they were tireless advocates of the right to counsel ever since. I want to first mention Walter Mondale, as the film pointed out, when Florida asked after cert was granted in Gideon for other states to come in and support and file for the court briefs and support of its position that there was no, that this should be left to the states. It's a matter of states' rights. The federal government shouldn't interfere with the right to counsel. And the word went out to all these attorney generals that pushed Jacob Dass to come in on Florida's side. We better not spend too much time thinking about what would happen if that request went out today. Because today, denying accused people adequate representation is an accepted strategy by many, not all certainly, but many prosecutors for enhancing their chances of winning cases. But in 1962, Walter Mondale was the young Attorney General of Minnesota, and like the Attorney General of the United States at the time, Robert Francis Kennedy, he was concerned about fairness. He was concerned about the integrity of the courts. He was concerned about a properly working adversary system. And he started the effort, which you saw described there, to convince 22 states to come in, not on Florida's side, but on Gideon's side, in support of the right to counsel, in support of equal justice, and in support of fairness. It made a huge impact. It was cited in Justice Black's opinion for the unanimous court. As some of you know, Walter Mondale continued in government service after that, becoming one of the great statesmen in our country. But tonight we recognize the extraordinary leadership that he provided in the case of Gideon versus Wainwright. And here to present the award is the senator from Minnesota, Amy Klobuchar.
I was sitting here, this is so great to be in the embrace of the Constitution Project, given that I've spent my entire week with the gun vote getting emails from people telling me I'm violating the Constitution, which I don't think is quite right. It was quite a week in the Senate, and it actually is really inspiring to be here and think about past fights that people stood up for and won, and that things aren't always won in 1 month or 1 year, and we will move on from there. I want to congratulate all of the honorees, of course, but I just wanted to say before I present the award a few just words about the Vice President, who has been my mentor since I got into politics. What many of you, the Minnesota people, know, but many of you don't know, is that my first job in Washington was as his intern. And my first job as his intern, when he was vice president, was crawling around under every piece of furniture in the vice president's staff and taking a furniture inventory for an entire month. And you will be happy to know that nothing was missing, as the vice president is very honest. And what I love to tell other students is that that was my first job in Washington, and this was my second. Very seriously. From there, I got to work with the Vice President and see him run for president, and like so many young girls at that time, I will never forget that moment. When he stood there in St. Paul with Geraldine Ferraro at his side and announced that he was picking the first woman vice presidential running mate. And I remember her white pearls, and I remember thinking that anything and everything is possible. I went on to be able to work with him at the Dorsey & Whitney law firm for a number of years, and then I later became a prosecutor. And when I hear this story, and I thought about it a lot when I was in my job for 8 years as the chief prosecutor for Minnesota's biggest county, you think about him, and then you think about the choices you have. Like, should you let the Innocence Project review all the murder cases you've had in the history of your office? I thought of Walter Mondale, and I said yes. And none of them were wrong. Or you think about, Should you go into the legislature and advocate for more funding for public defenders, and you think, what would Walter Mondale would do? He would have done that, and so I did it. Or you think about the Minnesota being a landmark state for actually videotaping every in-custody interrogation. And you have to decide, are you going to fight that, or are you going to go around the country and say it's a good idea, because that's what Walter Mondale would do? That's what we did in our office. So he has been an inspiration for justice, an inspiration for the country, and I'm just very honored to be here today to present him with this wonderful award. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy, for those kind words. In Minnesota, we're so proud of Amy. She won such a big victory in Minnesota last time that not only did she outpace anything I'd ever done, but from his grave I heard you would complain. And that's just the way it is, isn't it? She's a remarkable public servant. We're very proud of her. And I'm very grateful to you for being present here tonight. I got a call as a brand new Attorney General from Yale Kenazar, who was a criminal law professor at the University of Minnesota. And by the way, I've got the Dean of the University of Minnesota Law School, David Whitman, with us here tonight. And one of the brightest students, Mike Berman, here tonight from the University Law School. I can't go on anymore. And Kenazar said, did you get a letter from the Attorney General of Florida? I said, yeah, I just threw it away. He said, pardon me. He said, and he talked about it, and he said, we really, if you would, we'd like to get efforts going for an amicus brief on the side of Gideon. I said, if you'll help me, we'll do it. And he worked with Harvard, with Eddie McCormick, with people like Tom Eagleton, the great, great young Attorney General of Missouri. And we put, before we got done, as we've heard a couple times, we had, I think, 22 Attorneys General in the United States saying, yes, in America, at the state level, in our jurisdictions, every indigent felony defendant should be provided with counsel. And I think that Yale said that doesn't happen too often, where law enforcement officers stand up and plead for expanded rights for the defendants. He said about as often as Haley's Comet is observed is what happened. But we did it. I have to tell you, I don't think it was that hard. The public seemed to understand it. There's been strong support for the Gideon principle. As an old law enforcement officer who used to be on the other side, I'm comforted when the lawyer for the defendant is there to make the case and make certain that we don't just make mistakes as we proceed. So this is a principle that has been adopted now by the Supreme Court. In Gideon's life, the difference between having a lawyer and not one was 5 years. The first time around, without counsel, he was convicted, put in the slammer for 5 years. The second time around, with good counsel, before the Supreme Court and in a retrial in Florida, he was acquitted. And I think that's an example of how justice can work with proper counsel. This is a principle that's under severe strain now. I thought when the Supreme Court ruled that'd be it, and that's what the court said. But instead of that, across the country, as that excellent film showed, the way trials actually are run in some places in the country, the right to counsel is almost a disappearing right despite the decision. You have the public defenders who are overworked, their budgets are being cut, they've got caseloads that any lawyer in practice would never accept. But that's the deal. And there are some lawyers, regrettably, who are themselves having troubles. And they're not providing proper defenses, and sometimes they're providing shameful displays of how bad a lawyer can be. But we all know this, and we need to get back on reasserting the Gideon principle. There's one other point, and then I'll sit down. Today, trials are increasingly a rare thing in America. Over 90% of the crimes that are charged are never see the inside of a courtroom. And if I had a client who was charged with something, the fact that I could go to the court and make my case and maybe win it would be an important point of strength in dealing for justice in that trial or in any trial. But today, especially prosecutors who can be armed with these long sentences, indeterminate sentences, now with more and more criminal laws making different parts of the same act separate crimes, it is possible for a prosecutor who is so inclined to negotiate with the defendant on terms where most defendants plead guilty rather than to take a chance in the court. And so I would say it's sometimes called the trial penalty that's developed in America. People don't talk about it much, but I think this whole thing we work for, we're celebrating tonight, is slipping away under circumstances that shouldn't make us complacent at all. So let's get on with it and push again for public support for public defenders. I think we should urge the Supreme Court to put some more muscle into the Gideon principle. The idea that a counsel should be adequate proves to be a pretty loose standard. And although it's tough politically, I think everybody should try to stand up and put some energy behind this fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thank you so much for being here. You know, it's interesting, only 2% of cases involving poor people accused of crime in Georgia go to trial. Only 2% of all the cases. And I just recently talked about the trial penalty. I was involved in a capital case in Alabama where the plea offer was 8 to 10 years. When the fellow didn't take it, they got the death penalty. And now they're going to execute. The state was willing to be satisfied with 8 to 10 years, but today, because the man didn't take the guilty plea, he's very close to being executed. I next want to introduce Abe Crash, partner at Arnold & Porter, who is a young associate, worked with Abe Fortas on the Gideon case. Fortas demanded a lot, and Abe gave a lot, in educating Fortas about the right to counsel, working with him to shape the winning strategy. But beyond that, Abe Crash has provided us today with a marvelous link to Gideon at the creation. He has told the story of Gideon. I remember a few years ago I taught at Georgetown. He came to my class. He teaches constitutional law there. And he came to my class and he talked about Gideon. And it was spellbinding. Just a few weeks ago we had a symposium at Yale Law School and Abe came and he told about Abe Fortas and the work on the case and the strategy that developed. It was spellbinding. Just last month at the Constitution Project, he was speaking, and there have been a couple of zillion other places where he has gone and told this marvelous story and the characters in it and how it came together. And every time he speaks, it's spellbinding. Even if, like me, you've heard it before, it's still moving and it's still spellbinding. How fortunate for Clarence Earl Gideon that Abe Crash was his lawyer, along with, Abe Crash was his lawyer along with Abe Fortas, and of course the great work provided by John Hart Ely as a student at that time. And how fortunate all of us are to have him with this living history of the case that he provides us. I'm going to bring up Abe Crash.
Picture real quick. I don't know if I'm getting close with people like this. All right.
I want first of all to thank Ginny Sloan and her colleagues at the Constitution Project for all their efforts in arranging this splendid occasion. And I also want to thank Jones Day for providing us with this spectacular forum. I am touched by Steve Bright's generous remarks, and the tribute is a tribute, I should say, not just to me, but to all my colleagues who worked together with me, the team that worked together in writing the brief and whose names are on the brief in Gideon against Wainwright. There were four of us. Abe Fortas, who was appointed by the Supreme Court to represent Gideon, John Hart Ely, who was a third-year law student at the Yale Law School and was a summer clerk in our firm, and who later became one of the most distinguished scholars in the United States, Ralph Temple, who was an associate then and later became the chairman of the American Civil Liberties Union, and myself. I'm the only survivor of this quartet, the last of the Mohicans, so to speak, and I accept this tribute, this award, in the memory of my remarkable colleagues who, in the Gideon case. I also want to say a few words at the outset about my friend Tony Lewis. In years past, on the occasion of anniversaries of the Gideon case, he and I were frequently invited to participate in programs. I must say I look forward to seeing him here tonight. I am deeply saddened that he is not here. His book brilliantly captured, Gideon's Triumph, brilliantly captured the high drama of the Gideon case. I submit that it is one of the best, if not the very best book ever written about a Supreme Court case. And if not, it's certainly one of the most widely read. And it's done something else that's very profoundly important. For decades, it has encouraged young men and women to take up the legal profession and to enter public service. If there's to be honor accorded to the persons associated with the Gideon case, I should tell you it belongs in the first instance to the two architects of the case, to Abe Fortas, who was appointed by the court, and to Justice Black, who wrote the opinion. Measured by any standard, Abe Fortas was one of the greatest lawyers of his generation. You can hear his oral argument in the Gideon case, a superb argument in the Gideon case, it's on tape. Subsequently, Justice Douglas, in his memoirs, said that in the 36 years he was on the Supreme Court, the single best argument presented was by Abe Fortas in the Gideon case. Now, bearing in mind that Justice Douglas and Abe Fortas were very good friends, even making no allowance, nevertheless, that's very high praise indeed. For Justice Black, a defense lawyer was a necessity, not a luxury. Black had been a lawyer in Birmingham, Alabama, a very tough steel town at the turn of the century. He'd been a defense lawyer, a prosecutor, a police court judge, and he knew very well from personal experience how important it was to have a lawyer at your side. There was another aspect to Black's opinion. That was the profound empathy he had for persons who were underprivileged and disadvantaged, and that's reflected in the Gideon opinion. During the past 2 months, I have had the opportunity to participate in various events commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Gideon decision. And invariably, at these events, some participant remarks that the Gideon case has failed to fulfill the high expectations we had for it in 1963. I must say that's regrettably true. The Gideon decision did greatly inspire the public defender movement and significantly improve public representation of indigent defendants. But the fact remains that large numbers of defendants are incompetently and inadequately represented. The same point about hopes not fulfilled, I suggest to you, could be made about another great Supreme Court case, the decision in Brown against Board of Education. The high hopes we had about that have not been fulfilled either. But that point does not, in my judgment, denigrate in any respect from the significance and importance of the luster of those two cases. Rather, it should be a wake-up call that we have unfinished business to fulfill the great ideals reflected by those two cases. If the promise of Gideon is going to be realized, then I suggest to you that there's work to be done first by Congress, then by the Supreme Court and the lower federal courts, and then I would say also by the state legislatures, and finally by those of us who are private citizens. One of the most dramatic changes in the criminal law that's occurred since 1963 is the tremendous number of activities that have been criminalized, so that the criminal courts are now inundated, far, far from what was the case in 1963. The criminal courts are flooded with cases that don't belong there. The astronomical number of young black men who are incarcerated is absolutely unacceptable in a decent and just society. Present trends continue. 1/3 of black men with no college education are going to end up in jail. Now, Congress must enact legislation decriminalizing a number of offenses, and that will greatly affect the right to counsel. A number of state legislatures need to step up to the plate and to provide for the funds that are needed for decent, adequate public defender offices. The Supreme Court and the lower courts need to re-examine the standard, the very loose standard that's been adopted with respect to adequate and competent counsel. Finally, I should state, in my opinion, there is an underlying political reality that accounts for many of the failures to implement Gideon. Ask yourself this question. Who are the persons who are most adversely affected by the failure to provide counsel? Who are they? They are essentially poor people, members of minorities, people who are uneducated, illiterate, and lacking political clout. Approximately 80% of persons charged with a crime are poor. And over 70% don't even have a high school education. Now, the effective implementation, in other words, there's no effective political constituency for this right. And the effective implementation of the right to counsel, a right which we greatly admire and which is so vital in so many respects, it's going to require the support of the bar associations, of the law schools, of the private law firms, and of other organizations, people of goodwill, who are sensitive to the great need to provide a just and fair society. That is done, perhaps on other occasions, we will no longer say that the Gideon trumpet has been muted, but rather we will hear it in a very loud way. Thank you very much.
Stand by while we have technical difficulties. That's all right. We're going to see you. If you say so. I want to say with regard to that we are working with Arlen Porter, with A's firm, to try to take on systemically some of these problems that we've talked about. It's a great privilege for me to introduce so many of you who probably don't know Bruce Jacob to Bruce Jacob. Bruce joined the office of the Attorney General in Florida in 1960, right out of law school. And 2 years later, he was assigned to argue Gideon versus Wainwright in the Supreme Court of the United States. What an opportunity for a person who just got out of law school and wanted. And that's a great thing about going to Attorney General's offices, is often that happens. He was assigned the task, of course, as we've talked about, of arguing before one of the greatest lawyers, certainly at that time, maybe the greatest appellate lawyer in the country, A. Forrest. It must have been quite an experience, Bruce. I expect that it was exhilarating, but also a little terrorizing at the same time to be there. But once Gideon was decided, I want to tell you the rest of the story, because once Gideon was decided, Bruce Jacobs became a champion of the right to counsel for his whole life, right up until he walked in this door tonight. A mentor and an inspiration to so many lawyers who represented poor people accused of crimes is incomparable. The number of people that have been helped and the number of lives that have been touched. At Emory Law School in Atlanta, he set up the Legal Assistance Project for inmates at the Atlanta Penitentiary. The Supreme Court called him back to argue another case, the case of Kaufman versus United States, which he argued and which held in 1969 that a claim of unconstitutional search and seizures could be raised in habeas corpus. Not good one anymore, but it was good law then. He went to Harvard for a SJD degree and set up the Prisoner Legal Assistance Program, and still there to this day. So many of my students have participated in it. He supervised students representing poor people in both civil and criminal matters. And then he went to Ohio State University and was the director of clinical programs there. My friend Dennis Balsky, who was a great defender of poor people accused of crimes, told me that Bruce taught him, inspired him, and gave him critical advice during one of the first death penalty cases he tried. Bruce was later the dean at Mercer Law School and then at Stetson Law School. He's the dean emeritus at Stetson today. As I said before, it's impossible to know how many lives he touched and how many people were represented by his students, but we do know this. Bruce took on the post-conviction representation of a man who had been convicted of murder because the man's mother, the cleaning lady at the law school, told Bruce that she did not have the money to hire a lawyer. This is the very best kind of professor, the kind who teaches by example. Tonight we recognize Bruce Jacob for a lifetime of teaching, inspiring, and mentoring that made Gideon a reality. There you go. Oh, there you go.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen, for those generous remarks. Thank you very, very much. It's a tremendous honor and a privilege to receive this award in the company of such remarkable individuals as Vice President Mondale, Abe Crash, and Anthony Lewis. This award means a great deal to me and to my family. 3 members of my family are here, and I'd like to introduce them. They're sitting at this table. My daughter Leanne Gunn, son Brian, and wife Ann. During my teaching career, for many years, I taught clinical courses, supervising students in the representation of indigent defendants in criminal cases, as Stephen pointed out. We would lose a motion to dismiss or a motion to suppress, even though there was a United States Supreme Court decision that seemed to be squarely in point on our side. We would try to get that ruling overturned, and I found myself telling students more than once that just because the Supreme Court has decided a case doesn't mean that that decision is going to be immediately followed and accepted by the lower courts. I tell my students that sometimes it takes 50 years before a Supreme Court decision catches on and is accepted and followed and fully implemented by the lower courts throughout the country. Some courts are just not aware of the decision. Other judges know about it, but they don't like the decision and just don't follow it. I've known state judges who take the position that they do not have to follow U.S. Supreme Court decisions. Finally, 50 years or so after the Supreme Court has made a decision, lawyers, courts, and legislators throughout the United States get used to the decision and they begin to follow it and begin to implement it. Well, it's been 50 years since Gideon, and it's about time for that decision to catch on and to be fully implemented. It is not yet being fully or completely followed or implemented by our legislators or by our courts. When a public defender has such a heavy caseload that he or she can only spend 5 or 10 minutes conferring with an indigent client before allowing that client to plead guilty, the requirements of Gideon are not being met. Or when a public defender is handling so many cases that the defender, that defender can only spend an hour or an hour and a half preparing for a felony trial, even though a paid lawyer would spend 20 hours or more, the promise of Gideon is not being met. Gideon and the cases following Gideon require not merely that an indigent defendant should receive the assistance of counsel for his defense, the defendant is entitled to the effective assistance of counsel. And effective assistance cannot be provided by a public defender who has a caseload of 500, 600, or 700 felony cases per year. We certainly are better off now than we were before the Gideon case was decided, but we have a long way to go before the holding of Gideon really catches on and is fully implemented by legislatures and by the courts. And that's where the Constitution Project comes in. Ginny Sloan and all of those associated with the Constitution Project are doing everything they can to make the promise of Gideon a reality. On another subject, it's very sad that Anthony Lewis could not be here with us this evening. I met Tony Lewis on January 15, 1963, in the Supreme Court building on the day that the Gideon case was being argued. He sat inside the bar, far to the left as we faced the bench, and I believe he was using a small portable typewriter. During a break, probably the lunch break in the case, he came up to me and he introduced himself. He said that he was the Supreme Court reporter for the New York Times. He also told me he was not a lawyer, but he said the court allowed him to sit inside the bar, even though the bar inside the bar was usually reserved for members of the bar. After the argument, several weeks later, he phoned me. He said he had decided to write a book about the case and he wanted to interview me. My wife, Ann, and I met Tony at a hotel near the old Tampa airport. I was able to provide him with copies of letters and documents which we got from our file in the case. I understand that he was a consultant to those who made the film Gideon's Trumpet. For the most part, the movie was pretty accurate. However, the scene when I'm arguing, of course I'm arguing on the wrong side of the case, the courtroom was packed. In reality, though, there were only two persons in the courtroom other than the lawyers and the judges. One was Anthony Lewis, and the other was my wife, Ann. She was the only person in the entire spectator section of the court. It seems strange that for a case of that significance, there was only one person in the spectator section, but that was the way it was that afternoon. Also, the actor who was chosen to play my part in the movie has a southern accent. And of course, I was born and grew up in Chicago. Did you know that Tony played a small role in the movie? After the second trial, Gideon was standing at the door of the courthouse, and lawyers and friends crowded around him, and they asked, what can we do for you? What can we do for you? Is there anything we can get for you? And Gideon said, I sure would like a McDonald's hamburger. And Tony was the one in the film who hands him the money to buy a hamburger. After Gideon's Trumpet, Tony and I corresponded from time to time. Also, we had mutual friends who would relay messages back and forth between us. We participated in the panel discussion held at American University on the 30th anniversary of the Gideon decision. When I wrote a law review article about the Gideon case about 10 or 12 years ago, he read the draft of my article, and his response was helpful to me and was very much appreciated by me. 10 or 15 years ago, I invited him to be a speaker and panelist at a Stetson Law School conference held in Clearwater, Florida. He graciously accepted our invitation. His wife, Margaret Marshall, was with him, and the two of them, and Ann and I and our daughter Leanne, had dinner together. Leanne was a graduate student in journalism at the time, and of course she was thrilled to be able to have dinner with one of the great journalists and great writers and authors of our time. Also, I should add that being able to have dinner with Margaret Marshall, as well as Tony Lewis, made that dinner even more special. Tony Lewis was not only a great writer, he was a very good person, a very good human being. I sincerely wish that he could be here with us this evening. Again, I want to thank Ginny Sloan, all the members of the Constitution Project, and Stephen for this magnificent award. Thank you all very, very much.
segue to our last honoree as we turn now to remember Anthony Lewis. Like a lot of people who are here and who are public defenders, I was inspired by Tony Lewis's marvelous account of the Gideon case and Gideon's trumpet. It told us how desperately one needed a lawyer, one accused of a crime. It told us a lot about lawyering, about Abe Fortas and his team at the Supreme Court, and Fred Turner, the lawyer who represented Gideon at his retrial and brought about his acquittal. It told us what difference a lawyer makes. As Tony wrote in his article in the New York Times the next day, the day after the acquittal, the difference between the two trials was in the second one. Gideon had a lawyer. And after describing the decision, he wrote this: "It will be an enormous dream to bring to life the promise of Gideon versus Wainwright, the dream of a vast, diverse country in which every person accused of a crime will be capably defended, no matter what their economic circumstances, in which the lawyer representing him will do so proudly, without resentment of an unfair burden, and with the support and resources necessary to make an adequate defense." It was an enormous task, but it seemed like a worthwhile one, and I tried to play my part, and I've never regretted it. I also knew Tony Lewis, of course, from his column, At Home Abroad, or Abroad at Home. I never could keep track of where he was, given the name of the column, but I read it. For over 30 years, he was the nation's most eloquent advocate for justice in all sorts of areas. Not long after I left Washington and went to Washington 30 years ago, George Kendall and I were asked if we could help prepare a prominent Boston lawyer, Margaret Marshall, to argue before the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. She had taken on the case of Van Solomon, a man on death row, and she was arguing it pro bono. We, of course, were happy to do it. That's what we did, was work on death penalty cases there in Georgia. She let us know, though, that she'd be accompanied by her fiancé, Anthony Lewis. Our reaction to that was much like the reaction a 13-year-old kid might have had in 1927 if you said somebody's coming to visit and they're bringing their friend Babe Ruth along with them. We were absolutely thrilled that we were going to get to meet Tony Lewis. And of course, we were delighted to find Tony to be the kind, welcoming, gentle, and interesting, and marvelous human being he was. During the argument, I had one great memory of that argument, that Margaret was before the court arguing, and one of the judges on the court, not the friendliest panel, a lot friendlier than we have today, but anyway, one of the judges asked a question which was verbatim a question that George tried asking the movie. Tony was sitting a couple of rows ahead of us and kind of looked over his shoulder and raised his eyebrows and smiled and looked back. I'll never forget that. From then on, we were in touch. Tony was interested in what was happening on the ground in the courtrooms and how the right to counsel was being treated in courtrooms all over the country. He was dismayed that many jurisdictions simply disregarded Gideon, treating this an unfunded mandate. He wrote and spoke about it for the rest of his life with his usual grace and eloquence. For the last several years, I've made a trip to Cambridge just about every year and had dinner with Tony and Margaret. It was always a special evening, and it was enriched by Tony's wisdom and his perspective. Maybe one of the most memorable was the night we were at your place, and we were talking about South Africa, and a lot of people, including Albie Sachs, was there, who was justice on the South African Constitutional Court. He was, like I was, teaching in a little short session at Harvard. Last month, Tony Lewis participated in a panel at Brandeis on Gideon. I have it from a very reliable source who was there that he was the best person on the panel. And he was very funny a couple of times. His remarkable life ended a week later. We will have 3 remembrances of Tony in a moment, but first, I want to ask the great love of his life, the former Chief Justice of Massachusetts, and the woman who brought Anthony Lewis, the great lawyer who brought Anthony Lewis to Atlanta that time, Margaret Marshall, to come forward and say.
Steve, that was a wonderful introduction, but God, that oral argument was the worst I had ever had. God, those judges. Oh, I used to think about that sometimes when I was on the bench. It was awful. It was awful. I think Tony would have loved to have been here this evening. He really would. And I think for at least 2 reasons. First, Tony loved Jenny Sloan. He told me again and again and again about the extraordinary work that Jenny has done for so long to safeguard liberty, justice, and the rule of law. And for Tony, that was work of the highest order. So thank you, Jenny, on behalf of Tony. Second, and forgive me, Jenny, but this was his greater love. Tony loved the Constitution of the United States. He loved the Constitution. He lived the Constitution. He taught the Constitution. He believed in the Constitution. And he wrote about the Constitution over and over and over again. The United States, he said, has been shaped by arguments over the Constitution as it has been by the Constitution. That was in 1987. In the end, he said, the distinctive character of the American Constitution does not lie in this particular clause or that. It lies in our willingness to accept the Constitution, interpreted by judges, as law. Other peoples, he said, look to pageantry, or history, or ethnic identity, or ideology. Our national sense of legitimacy rests on law. The United States is a country extraordinarily rich and extraordinarily free, he continued. We achieved that because of our commitment to the ideas proposed on September 17, 1787. That is what Tony believed. Clarence Earl Gideon made the Constitution work. For Tony, Gideon's trumpet was his attempt to teach that even a man tossed aside by life, as Tony described Gideon, could make the Constitution work. Gideon's trumpet was written for adults, Tony thought, until the daughter of a friend, then in 7th grade, told Tony she had just finished reading it. But it's for adults, Tony protested. Oh, that's okay, she replied. I got double book credit for it. Last week I had this message from his now grown-up reader. I have to believe the world is a better place because Tony lived in it, she wrote. Wherever he is, I'll bet he's getting double credit. Tony never lost faith in our ability to make the Constitution work. Never. But it will not happen automatically, he wrote in his last column for the New York Times on December 15, 2001. Freedom under law is hard work, he wrote. If rulers cannot be trusted with arbitrary power, it is up to citizens to raise their voice to injustice. Thank you, and thank everyone this evening for raising your voices to injustice. Tony lives in each one of you. Thank you.
Our first remembrance comes from his colleague and friend at Harvard Law School, Charles Ogletree. By videotape.
Hello, my name is Charles Ogletree. I'm the Jesse Klinenko Professor of Law here at Harvard Law School. and the founder and the director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice. Before my time at Harvard, however, I served as a public defender in Washington, D.C. for 8 years. It's those 8 years that crystallized in me the importance of the right to counsel. It was in 1963 that the Supreme Court heard the case of Clarence Darrell Gideon, a young white man who was charged with misdemeanor burglary in Florida, and yet didn't have a lawyer, and didn't have representation, and had no funds to buy one. And the Supreme Court decided in 1963, with an opinion written by Justice Hugo Black, and a unanimous opinion, that Mr. Gideon and defendants like him would have the right to counsel going forward. It was a tremendous opinion in 1963 and resonates with us now in terms of what the Supreme Court could do. What made all this significant was not just the Gideon decision, but there was a young man from New York who was a Harvard College graduate in 1948 who wrote a book called Gideon's Trumpet. That young man was Anthony Lewis. Anthony Lewis was a journalist, but he also understood the importance of law. He won the Pulitzer Prize more than once because of his successful writing. And he also made it clear that he was not only concerned about the right to counsel, but he was concerned about civil rights. He had grave concerns about the war in Vietnam. He had very many concerns about the issues of race in America. What makes this so important is that 50 years ago, the Supreme Court understood the right to counsel and the need for it. And yet today we find ourselves with people in jail without lawyers, without representation, and some of them even facing death penalty. So we have a long way to go. And we should celebrate the Gideon decision and celebrate the important work that Anthony Lewis did in making the Gideon decision so important. So he was very much involved in everything that we think about today. So as we celebrate Gideon and celebrate Anthony Lewis, we do so recognizing that things changed tremendously 50 years ago. And yet the case and Mr. Lewis are reminded that we have to be just as diligent in the 21st century as we were in the last century. I salute Anthony because I had a great time with him here in Massachusetts, spending time with him and his wife, Margie Marshall, on Martha's Vineyard, and talking about the great things that were accomplished, and yet we had a long way to go. He even came to my house recently when we met with President Obama to celebrate his running for a second-term election. And it just reminded us that we've come a long way in 50 years, but we still have a long way to go. So today, let's salute Anthony Lewis for the great work he did, and salute Clarence Darrell Gideon for the important decision he made as a poor man, as a white man, pushing for justice. And I hope that those who are the babies of Gideon, those who were born before 1963 or right after 1963, will remember that it is an important decision that we all have to fight for. And we have to make sure that we are Gideon's legend of leaders in the 21st century, and will bring back the right to counsel and make it very effective in the 21st century. I hope you'll join me in this struggle, because it's a struggle that continues as we go forward. Thanks to Anthony Lewis, and thanks to Clarence Darrell Gideon. Thank you very much.
And now I'd like to introduce Tony's colleague and friend at the New York Times, Jack McKinnon.
Thanks for saving the water. Thank you, Vance. Margie, Jenny, Vice President, everybody else. I'm going to demonstrate why I was in print. I can't even. Well, I'm doing that. I don't charge you with this time for time. You mentioned the shape of the bench and where people sat. And I was privileged to sit in one of those front row seats, which was really quite privileged. And that lasted for years. And they even had the system opinions downstairs they waited for me. And when Warren Burger became the Chief Justice, I was right under his jowl. And I looked up at him, and he looked down at me, and I didn't have to, he couldn't have spoken this. He said, with his eyes, "What the hell are you doing here?" And shortly after that, they changed the shape of the bench so that those seats were
eliminated. They had a good reason. The reason was the justices couldn't hear each other. And they kept they interrupted each other anyway, but they had less of an excuse if they saw that somebody was speaking. So that was a privilege that Tony had, we all had. Such is the fame of Tony Lewis that he nearly eclipsed his own reputation as the revolutionizer of Supreme Court coverage. Over the 32 years of his demanding and passionate column writing, I encountered many who called themselves fans of Tony's, who had no memory of his revolutionary legal writing. And only faintly, that is aside from the human rights scope that he was in, the Supreme Court part of it, and only faintly recalled what his Pulitzer Prizes were about. The first was for exposing an ugly facet of McCarthyism, and the second was for his reporting on reapportionment. One writer has even criticized Adam Liptak's excellent obituary for leading with Tony's Supreme Court achievements rather than the columns that influenced his generation. I hardly agree with Adam's emphasis and hope that I can further balance out his reputation. I think I first encountered Tony in 1954, and by the way, there are a lot of personal references here. That's the point, I guess, that I was asked to speak about my experience with Tony. It's not too much about Gideon. I encountered him, his article in the Reporter magazine in 1954. It was about the Chazanow case that led to his Pulitzer Prize. And I was in the Navy at the time, and I'd been a student of McCarthyism from college, and I wanted to be involved in that fight, and I had a job as a copy boy at the Washington Post for a summer, then I went to the Navy. Anyway, I not only admired the story, I was deeply jealous of it, and I couldn't wait to get back to the Post and where they were fighting McCarthyism tooth and nail, and I got my old job back, still a copy boy. At the Post, Tony had a great admirer in Alan Barth, really the greatest editor writer who ever lived, and another hero of mine. And I think I first saw Tony in person one day in '62 or '63 when I was walking, strolling actually, right up to the Supreme Court, and for a day to help out on the caseload. And Tony simply ran from behind, ran right by me, kept running up to the Supreme Court. And I kept walking, and I said to myself, hey, he's got 2 Pulitzers, and he's running, and I'm just walking. Tony's reporting of justice issues was already high grade and sophisticated, with Scotty Reston pressed by Justice Felix Frankfurter to improve the Times' Supreme Court coverage, assigned to the court after the year he had at Harvard Law School on anemia. On his return, Tony's scholarship was just hit the ground running, and his authority and scholarship quickly showed up in the paper's columns. Frankfurter, the famous meddler and provocateur, wasn't through. And for Washington, you may know this or you may not know this, but he then went to work on Phil Graham, to having converted the Times. And a few years later, Phil acted, and he called up to Creighton, it was covering the lower courts, and said, I've decided, Jim, are you here? You're supposed to be here. If he's not, I'm sorry. He said, Creighton, we're going to cover the Supreme Court as well as the Times, and you're going to do it. And so he called up Griswold and said, would you take this fellow for a semester? That's all they could do. And Griswold said yes. And then Phil hung up the phone and said, well, that'll cost me a building at the school. But 4 years later, they promoted Jim, and then the both sent me to Harvard, even though I failed to get a Neiman. I just applied and just didn't get it. It was pretty hard not to get it. I asked Tony for advice as to what to do, because he had really, he totally covered Harvard and the law school. He just knew everything where everybody was buried and everybody was active. And I asked him for advice on courses, and he said, well, I took civil procedure, and I took Paul Freund's constitutional law, and Henry Hart's federal courts. And so that's what I did, except that I didn't do one thing that he did. He took exams and got A's in all of them. And I decided, well, even if I got A's in all of that, I would only duplicate it. But I wasn't going to get all A's. So I decided to do something else with that time. But I had the same, I claim the same lineage. I mean, Frankfurter's agitation, and then Paul Freund's counseling and mentoring. And Paul Freund said, you may take my course, all my courses, but you must take Henry Hart's federal course. And of course, a lot of lawyers who come to the court don't know about that course. And people who know about it are the Federalist Society knows it really well, to their profit. A lot of people who have law degrees just don't understand what, this is a Frankfurter concoction, it's the whole federal courts and federal jurisdiction, state jurisdiction structure. So I claim that legacy for myself, and I appreciate that so many of us were beneficiaries of it. Frankfurter, the stories have said that Frankfurter wrote to Scotty Reston that there are not two justices on the Supreme Court who know the court better than Tony. He didn't say who the one justice was, but we didn't have to guess who that was. He said there was nobody else on the Supreme Court who understood it as well as Tony. And that was what I was supposed to compete with when after my year at Harvard. So I went with finally with a couple of strikes on me. To my relief, while I was there, Tony was sent to London, and so I was with ordinary competition to my great relief. It wasn't until I got to Harvard that I read Tony's really great law review article in 1957 about reapportionment. It was a roadmap for litigants how to get to Baker against Carr. And that's what, it was really told them how to do it, and they did it. And then when they finally handed down Baker against Carr, they gave Tony a Pulitzer Prize for that. I always thought it was not so much the story as that he just sort of helped to invent the whole thing. He was just very, very creative, and there was no way to guess what he was doing while you were trying to compete with it. And luckily, I didn't have to. I have one little episode more to tell you, and that was that as I was getting myself ready to go to my year at Harvard, there was an ADA convention in New York, and I went to cover it, and Tony was there. Tony was at a table with some justices of the preeminent people of the bar, and I was at the little press table. And Tony came over to me and he said, Tom Clark would like to meet you. And I was stunned that he did that, and I went and shook hands with Tom Clark. He didn't turn out to be a great source, but it was something to be given. And I always thought that it might be, not always, for some years I thought maybe Tony was going to tell me that he was so confident that no matter who you were, who you were going to be, what kind of reporting you were going to do, he didn't have to worry about you knowing the source of his. He didn't have to, it didn't bother him that he was sharing a source. Jenny asked me how long I plan to serve, to speak. And I said 5, 10, 15. And I said, you know, lots to say. And she said, I'm at 5. So I've been trying to give you 5. It's a challenge. And I failed at that. But it's also a privilege to be asked to do Tony justice.
And finally, a columnist who's made such important and insightful contributions to the public discussion, E.J. Gideon.
First, I just want to say, Mr. Vice President, is Vice President Mondale still here? Oh, what I wanted to tell him, tell him I said it when he comes back. I just want to say Norwegian charisma always worked for me. And it's so good to have you here tonight. And Marty, I just want to say what an incredible privilege it is to speak tonight, really for the appreciation that all of us have for Tony, his life, his writing, his warmth, and his courage. And turns out we like some of the very same words, and as you will see tonight, because I think nothing could so honor Tony as his own words, and I'm going to share some of those with you tonight. But recent days, I think, have reminded us all of how much we miss his voice. I have been asking myself over and over again the essential question, what would Tony say? I miss knowing what Tony Lewis would say about the horror and outrage of the attacks on the innocents in Boston, a city he so loved. He felt an affection for and a connection to that city that so many of us here feel tonight. I also miss that Tony would have been the first to point out that Boston is the cradle of liberty. And being a very careful journalist, he would also note that Philadelphia battles Boston for that title. Tony would have insisted that deeply justified anger should never, ever, ever make us forget the rights guaranteed under our Constitution. He would insist, calmly but urgently, that protecting the rights of all of us, especially under the most difficult and challenging circumstances, is essential to protecting the rights of each of us, including our own. And he did that over the 10 years of the war on terror. Here's what Tony wrote about this in that last New York Times column. He said, "The men who met in Philadelphia in 1787 set out to create a nation from struggling states so distant from each other that it took 7 days for George Washington to learn that New Hampshire had provided the needed 9th vote to bring their Constitution into being. They wagered that a national government based on written rules could hold the country together. Intricate checks and balances, they reasoned, would prevent the abuses of power that tempt all politicians. They put their faith not in men, but in law, the law of the Constitution." I hope, forgive me for saying that I really wish Tony were around to comment on the morally obtuse refusal of the United States Senate to pass even a modest measure to expand I could be wrong,
but I just have a feeling that in his very elegant way, he would have skewered him. And I also wish he were here to offer his views on what the Second Amendment actually means. I wish he were here to comment on so many other things, but we can be so grateful that he did raise his voice so powerfully in his path-breaking legal journalism that, as Jack noted, transformed the way the Supreme Court was covered in his books, especially Gideon's Trumpet that we honor tonight, especially and in the column he wrote for 32 years. He would actually, I think, disdain the title of Crusader because he'd probably remark on the historical difficulties of that particular term. But whatever word one uses, he was a battler on behalf of rights, particularly the rights of those who held unpopular views, the rights of the outcast, the rights of the ignored. As Jack mentioned, his first Pulitzer Prize in 1955, when he was 28 years old, was for a series of articles on Abraham Chazanow, a Navy employee unjustly accused during the McCarthy era, and Chazanow credited Tony Lewis's work for his vindication. That 63 Pulitzer citation, the 1963 Pulitzer citation, singled out the coverage of Baker v. Carr. And Jack was absolutely right that, in a way, Tony wrote Baker v. Carr. Adam Liptak noted, and I quote, "Mr. Lewis did more than cover the decision. An article on legislative apportionment that he had written for the Harvard Law Review was cited in the decision at footnote 27. I wish Tony were around now to cover the current forms of gerrymandering and our increasingly unrepresentative form of government. I would love it if he could provide another footnote 27 for a decision on this matter. I wish he were around to talk about filibuster abuse. I regarded doing justice to Tony's legacy as such a heavy burden that I knew I needed counsel, and I knew I couldn't count on the Supreme Court to guarantee it to me. So I called my friend Link Kaplan, another great friend of Tony's, and I said I wanted to share his thoughts tonight, and he kindly provided them, and I just want to share a few words from Link. Here's Link. He said, "Gideon's Trumpet is beautifully written, with a spare yet romantic eloquence. Anthony Lewis's prose provides a lesson about the power of storytelling and about the capacity of simple, direct writing to achieve a form of grandeur." Here is the opening of Gideon's Trumpet. In the Morning Mail of January 8, 1962, the Supreme Court of the United States received a large envelope from Clarence Earl Gideon, prisoner number 003826, Florida State Prison, P.O. Box 221, Rayford, Florida. Like all correspondence addressed to the court, generally rather than to any particular justice or court employee, it went to a room, I went to a room at the top of the great marble steps, so familiar to Washington tourists. There, a secretary opened the envelope. As the return address had indicated, it was another petition by a prisoner without funds asking the Supreme Court to get him out of jail, another in the secretary's eyes because pleas from prisoners were so familiar a part of her work. She walked into the next room and put the envelope on the desk of an assistant clerk of the United States Supreme Court, and thus did history begin. To understand Tony's influence, Link went on, you might make two lists. The first would be those who came before him who seriously shaped the conception of journalism about law and its practice. And Link writes, there was no one on it. And then he writes, the second would be of those who came after, who have had a notable impact and who were strongly influenced by him. It is an impressive list in newspapers. It included Fred Graham, his successor at the Times and a shaper of television coverage of the court, and Linda Greenhouse, who covered the court superbly for the Times, and now Adam Liptak, its current and brilliant correspondent. The magazines includes Jeff Toobin at the New Yorker, Jeff Rosen at the New Republic, Emily Bazelon and Dahlia Lithwick at Slate. In broadcast journalism, it includes Nina Totenberg of NPR, and so many others that we have not. Link, I should say, any great court reporters call Link, because there are a great many others, but that is an excellent list, and they were all shaped by what Tony Lewis did. Anthony Lewis, he concluded, is generally credited with being the first journalist to report about Supreme Court opinions
as statements at a moment in time about a long conversation regarding legal reasoning. He explained, as no one ever had in American journalism, the context and the consequences of court rulings. In Gideon's Trumpet, he explained the enormous power of the Supreme Court through the power of public opinion when he called, quotes, the opportunity not to command, but to persuade. But the eloquence that he ascribed to the court was that much more so because of his own uncommon eloquence. The title of Anthony Lewis's book is from the book of Judges. But the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, and so did Anthony Lewis. I want to close with words from that final column, written on December 15, 2001. Thank God and thank Tony Lewis. He didn't stop writing after that final column, but I was struck by many of the same words. He wrote, I am an optimist about America, but how can I maintain that optimism after Vietnam, after the murder of so many who fought for civil rights, after the Red Scare, and after the abusive tactics planned by government today? I can because we have regretted our mistakes in the past, relearning every time that no ruler can be trusted with arbitrary power, and I believe we will again. The hard question is whether our commitment to law will survive the new sense of vulnerability that is with us all after September 11th. It is easy to tolerate dissent when we feel safe. But after all, this has always been a country of unbounded optimism, a country that struggles with itself and conquers corrupting habit. In my lifetime, we have carried out 2 revolutions, unfinished but extraordinary. The ending of racial discrimination and the move toward equality for women. 32 years ago, few imagined that the Secretary of State could be anything but a white male. In the end, I believe that faith and reason will prevail, but it will not happen automatically. Freedom under law is hard work. If rulers cannot be trusted with arbitrary power, it is up to citizens to raise their voices at injustice. The most important office in democracy, Justice Louis Brandeis said, is the office of citizen. And that's what Tony Lewis said. Tony blazed trails, and he inspired us as a writer and a moral voice. But above all, he was a model in living up to the obligations of a free citizen. And I think we should all follow his injunction about our obligations, and we should try to live up to his example. Thank you.
That was wonderful. My name is Armando Gomez. I'm the chair of the Constitution Project's Board of Directors. And I'd like to thank all of you on behalf of the board and Jenny and our wonderful staff for coming out to support the Constitution Project and to help honor these 4 luminaries this evening. Let me also thank Jones Day for hosting this event and this wonderful venue, and Stephen Bright for your remarks throughout the evening. I don't want to keep you long, but I do want to remind you the Constitution Project is an organization that, in the words we were just reminded of from Tony Lewis, takes on the hard work of fighting for a Constitution. This week alone, many of you saw the release of the report of the Task Force on Detained Treatment, released on Tuesday and widely reported, and then this wonderful event tonight, honoring the legacy of Gideon and the video that the Health Farm reporter was released last month on the 50th anniversary of the decision. This is hard work. It takes the work of Jenny and the staff, so many volunteers, a number of whom are here in this room today, but also those who have sponsored the Constitution Project. And thanks to you who did that by coming here tonight. As you go home this evening, please go home safely and take a supporter card on your way out so that we can keep doing this very hard work to defend the Constitution. Thank you.